Okay. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahana Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti 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 Chaitanyam Sarvagam Sarvam Sarvabhuta Guhashayam Yat Sarva Vishayatitam Tasmai Sarva Vide Namaha. Om. Very good. Nice to see you all. Happy New Year, if I haven't been able to wish you before. We have just begun chapter 18 of Shankara's great work, Upadesha Sahasri. As I mentioned in the prior class, it's not only the longest chapter, it's arguably the most important chapter. It's entitled Tatvamasi. And the reason it's entitled Tatvamasi encompasses the entire teaching of Advaita Vedanta. This chapter similarly encompasses the entire chapter, but its length and its position at the end of this text, there's only one more chapter after this, its length and position suggests that it serves a further purpose in addition to just giving you the whole picture of Vedanta, the whole teaching of Vedanta, and that further purpose is addressing and negating opposing points of view. So it's a very important style of teaching in Advaita Vedanta to not ignore arguments, to address arguments head on. And the way that's done is by intentionally raising those arguments in a process that's called purva paksha, and then negating, refuting those arguments. And we'll see that as we go along, and I'll explain it more at that time. So this morning we continue. We just began chapter 18, so we're at the very beginning. So chapter 18 opens with some very profound teachings about the nature of enlightenment. The nature of enlightenment is... I'm pausing because this happens to be so widely misunderstood. What do we mean by enlightened? And in particular, who gets enlightened? And we've discussed in this class and elsewhere the fact that sat-chit-ananda Atma doesn't get enlightened, doesn't need to get enlightened, doesn't need Advaita Vedanta, doesn't need Swami Tadatmananda, doesn't need any of this. Who needs to get enlightened is the one who says, I suffer. And that one who says, I suffer, generally has a physical body, certainly has a mind, and in that mind is a particular thought that says, I. We call that thought ahankara, ego, the self-identity. So enlightenment, then, is removing this false I. Or removing is not the right word. We've also had this discussion at great length, and this is not the time for big, long discussion. We're not trying to destroy the ego, as so many people like to say. The ego is a normal part. Who gave you an ego? You were born with it. It's natural. It's part of Ishvara's creation. So therefore, we're going to destroy it. Just like Ishvara has given us a beautiful planet, which we seem hell-bent upon destroying. So it's a natural part of the universe, having a sense that I am me, I am an individual. We're not trying to destroy it. We're trying to, in fact, to use my guru's words, we're trying to enlighten it. And enlightened ego is the goal. And this is a good place. This is a huge topic, and this is not the right time and place for a discussion about enlightened ego. We've come across it before. We'll come across it again. So all of this is to establish what we are seeking to do. What we are seeking to do is not to somehow, it's not a process of transformation. Atma is already sat-chit-ananda Atma, doesn't need to be transformed, doesn't need to be purified, doesn't need anything. The problem is confusion in our mind, false identification with your body and mind, and that false identification needs to be removed. The removal of that false identification is enlightenment. And if you say, that's all? That's all. Of course, how to remove that false identification is another matter, so we'll see that as we go along. Okay, let's get started with today's verses. Sad brahma ham karomiti, sad brahma ham karomiti, pratyayavatma sakshikau, pratyayavatma sakshikau, tayor ajnana jasyaiva, tayor ajnana jasyaiva, tyago yuktataro mataha, tyago yuktataro mataha. So, there are two possible thoughts that one might have in his or her mind. The second line, pratyayao. You have to break these words apart. It's a dual declension. There are two pratyayas, two thoughts. Let's call them two conclusions. That would be more accurate. There are two conclusions that one can have in your mind. One conclusion is sad brahma aham. I am the reality known as Brahman, is one possible thought you might have in your mind. And the other thought you might have in your mind is aham karomi iti. I am an individual person engaged in action. Obviously, these are statements that represent enlightenment and the absence of enlightenment. Enlightenment is when, notice the pronoun aham, I here, is crucial. So an enlightened person is one, and this is to follow up a little bit on my introduction, where the I is a pronoun. Pronouns, by the very word pronoun, it stands for a noun. What noun? Which noun? Generally, I gets connected to body. If I say I am a man, maleness belongs to this body. Or if I say I'm feeling good today, for a change. So then I represents prana, life force, energy. Prana belongs to the individual person. So that I gets connected elsewhere. If I say I'm in a good mood, that I is connected to the mind. But suppose I say I am unchanging consciousness. I am the unchanging consciousness that reveals the activities of this mind. There you go. That's a very different definition of I. And the enlightened ego is one that has been redefined. Instead of that I, pronoun, instead of that I referring to body, mind, prana, senses, etc., that I is redefined, we could say reconnected, as it were, with your true nature as pure consciousness. So, this reconnection of the ego all takes place in your mind. This is all a mental activity. The problem of confusion is located in your mind. Therefore, enlightenment is a process that must take place in your mind, nowhere else. The problem is in your mind, so therefore the locus where the solution has to be applied is in your mind. In your mind now we can have these two different conclusions. The first conclusion, sadaham, sad brahma aham, I am Brahman. I am that pure consciousness. But your mind can also have the contrary thought. I am an individual person with a body, with a mind, engaged in various kinds of action. Karomi, aham karomi iti. Pratyayao, these two different thoughts, these two different conclusions, this is a very profound observation. Shankara says they are both atma, sakshi, cow dual ending again. They are both revealed or witnessed by consciousness. If you have the thought, I am a limited individual, that thought is revealed by consciousness, which is limitless. Can I say that again? Think about that. If you have the thought, I am a limited individual, okay, that's a thought. It's a normal thought. How do you know you have that thought? It's revealed to you. It's witnessed by you in your essential nature as pure consciousness, the pure consciousness which has no boundary or limit. So the sense of being a limited individual, jiva, is revealed or witnessed by your true nature, atma sakshikao. So it is witnessed by your true nature. So that I am a limited individual is a thought witnessed by consciousness. That I am Brahman is the contrary thought. Is one witnessed more than the other? They're just thoughts. They're just thoughts. But now, thoughts have consequences. Everything has a consequence. What is the consequence of taking yourself to be a limited individual? The consequence is suffering. What is the consequence of having an enlightened ego and being able to say, I am nothing but Brahman, pure consciousness? That thought has very different consequences. We could just say the removal of suffering. One conclusion leads to suffering. The other conclusion removes suffering. Which one would you prefer? Obvious, but now here we start arguing. And it's a good thing. I just got done talking about Purva Paksha, so we should argue now. And it says, wait a minute, thoughts can be right or wrong. Thoughts can be correct or incorrect. Thoughts can be based on knowledge or based on ignorance. So which of these two thoughts is correct? If Vedanta says, aham brahma asmi, how do you know that thought is correct? Because you have the thought, I am a limited individual, and it certainly seems more plausible than the thought, I am Brahman. The thought, I am a limited individual, is supported by all of your experiences, almost all of your experiences from the time of birth. I said almost because you can have meditative experiences, etc., which are not limited. But generally speaking, your experience right now, do you experience yourself as infinite consciousness, or do you experience yourself as a person sitting in the chair? Obvious. So your experience tells you one thing, and the scriptures tell you another. That's where we have arrived. Your experience tells you you are a limited individual. Scriptures say you're not a limited individual. You are pure consciousness. And now the question is, which one of these should we accept? Well, your experience that leads you to conclude that you're a limited individual, has that conclusion led you to a condition free from suffering up to the present time? No, it only perpetuates the suffering, because you take yourself as a limited individual, you chase around in the world trying to find something to make you full and complete. You fail to find anything that makes you full and complete. You remain as a limited individual. On the other hand, scriptures say you are Brahman, and those who have realized the truth of those statements say, hey, this thought puts an end to suffering. Now, you may not have had that conclusion. Notice I said conclusion, not a thought. It's easy to have the thought, I am Brahman. It's just 3 words. But to have the conclusion, to have the discovery that indeed my true nature is Brahman is quite different. So someone who's had that discovery says, hey, this thought, this discovery can put an end to suffering. So you have a conclusion that perpetuates suffering. This other conclusion, you're told, puts an end to suffering. So which one is more valuable? And that's what Shankara concludes here. He says, Tayoho, of those 2 thoughts, ajnana jasya eva, the thought born of ignorance, tyagaha yukta taraha mataha. Mataha is considered yukta taraha, most fit for being tyagaha, for being rejected. The thought born of ignorance should be rejected. The thought born of wisdom should be accepted. Now, let's be the Purva Pakshi right now and challenge us. Wait a minute. What if I am a limited individual is born of knowledge? And the fellow who says, I am Brahman is a thought that puts an end to suffering, suppose that's delusion. How can we be sure that which one of these statements is correct? That's what the whole teachings of Vedanta are about. We use, as we've discussed so many times, we use Shruti, Yukti, and Anubhava to ascertain what is real, what is true, what is to be accepted, and what is untrue, and what is to be rejected. For example, that I am a limited individual can be rejected through Shruti, Yukti, and Anubhava. Through Shruti, which do we want to do that first? Yeah, we'll do that one first. Through Shruti, in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is famous for saying, it feels like your mind gets active, it feels like your mind gets quiet. Dhyayati eva, it says, which means that the activity, bad example, not, it's a great example, but it would take me 2 hours to explain it. I'm so bad in the sense that it's not a simple, accessible one. Let's give a simple, accessible example. It's found in another scripture which you've all studied, Bhagavad Gita, where Sri Krishna says, I don't do anything at all, even while walking, talking, etc., etc. You remember that. Because it's a very striking statement. Na karomi ati. Sri Krishna says, I don't do anything at all. So here we have, first of all, scripture supporting that I am Brahman, and scripture negating aham karomi, that I am a limited individual engaged in action. Then yukti, reasoning. We use Vedanta. Nice, there's a Western philosophical term, Occam's razor. That which, and in fact we have the same, very similar expression in Sanskrit. Jnana asi. Jnana asi. Asi is sword. Jnana asi, the sword of knowledge. So the idea of a razor or a sword of knowledge is that which can separate two things. Not destroy, separate. And here, what we're separating is atma and anatma. Consciousness and all that is known to consciousness. And with that, and that's yukti, right? So this sword of knowledge is an application of yukti, reasoning. We use that reasoning to discern what is atma, consciousness, what is anatma, that which is insentient, that which is material, and we apply that to ourselves, and we discover this body is anatma, this mind is anatma, thoughts are anatma. Why are thoughts anatma? They're known to atma. Anything known by definition is anatma. So, by the way, this is one of the central teachings, so we're not going to go into this Shruti, Yukti, and Anubhava at great length. I'm just pointing out that why do we accept the thought, I am Brahman, and reject the thought, I am a limited individual engaged in activity? We accept one and reject the other based on Shruti, Yukti, and Anubhava. So Shruti says, yes, indeed, you are Brahman. You are not a limited individual engaged in action. Yukti, reasoning, leads us to the same conclusion. I am consciousness, and as consciousness, I am separate and independent from the body, mind, senses, and everything else. And then finally, Anubhava. You say, Swamiji, it certainly seems more plausible, since my experience is that I'm an individual person. Tell me, has your experience ever fooled you in your lifetime? In fact, we're going to see this much more in the next verse. You've heard me give the example of the sunset 1,000,000 times. So you've never seen the sun go down. It doesn't go down. The horizon moves up. Your experience, and even though you know that in principle, you continue to be confused about it. Experience is misleading. Your experience of being an individual person is misleading. So now we're using Anubhava. Shruti, Yukti, Anubhava. Your experience is misleading. Further, your experience of being a limited individual goes away when you meditate, if you're a good meditator. So tell me, do you go away when you meditate? Do you cease to exist when you meditate? That sense of being an individual person engaged in action, seriously, the sense of being a meditator goes away in a state of absorption. Goes away. You're no longer a meditator engaged in a practice of meditation. What remains in that state of absorption is just consciousness. So look at that. Your feeling of being an individual person goes away, but you remain. That which comes and goes, who are you? Are you something that blinks on and off like a light bulb? Or are you a consistently existent conscious being, continually existent conscious being. So a little bit of analysis of anubhava is all we need. So here we have these two conflicting statements. Both statements are in your mind, both conclusions abide in your mind. One conclusion is based on Shruti, Yukti, and Anubhava. The other conclusion, that I'm an individual being struggling to get a little bit of happiness out of life and engaged in so many activities to get that little bit of happiness in life, though that conclusion is based on ignorance and therefore negated by Shruti, Yukti, and Anubhava. So this is talked about further in this next verse, where Shankara says, Sarasmiti pramanota, Sarasmiti pramanota, dhiranyatani bodhbhava, dhiranyatani bodhbhava, pratyakshadinibhavapi, pratyakshadinibhavapi, Bhadyate digbramadivata, Bhadyate digbramadivata. An extension of the prior verse, Sad asmi iti, Sad brahma asmi iti. The prior verse says, the thought, the conclusion that I am Brahman is pramana utadhihi. It is, dhihi is in the next line. Dhihi. It is a conclusion that is pramana uta. It is born of a valid means of knowledge. What is a valid means of knowledge? Another huge topic, but your eyes are a means for gaining knowledge of form. Your ears are a means of knowledge for gaining knowledge, experience of sound. Anumana, inference, is a means for gaining knowledge of the fire on the mountain where you only see smoke. So I'm just giving some examples of what is a pramana, a valid means of knowledge. Here's a challenging question. Is experience a pramana? Is experience a valid means of knowledge? How many times have you been fooled by an optical illusion? Like the sunset? Experience is most certainly not a valid means of knowledge. Experience is what you experience. You know, it just is. It cannot be trusted. It's unreliable. If you're going for medical treatment, generally you like to look at the statistics. I don't know about you, I do. I like to look at the statistics and see, is this treatment statistically helpful or not? Because I want my decisions to be based on have an authoritative basis. Because if I don't check out the authoritativeness of the data, I could make some pretty stupid decisions with regard to my health or anything else. Most of our decisions in life are based on our experiences, which are how authoritative? Are they absolutely trustworthy? Can you be sure that everything you experience is what it seems to be? I learned that lesson. This is a little tricky story to talk about, but I learned that lesson as a stupid teenager when I took LSD. You have all kinds of experiences, none of which are real. They're the result of putting this chemical in your brain. Well, wait a minute. In your brain right now, there's no LSD, I presume. But there are lots of other chemicals, like dopamine. An excess of dopamine can make you hallucinate. In fact, people who have bipolar disorder and have periods of mania, they have excess dopamine. They hallucinate. You hear voices. You see things. You have dopamine in your brain right now. How do you know that you're not... What a question. How do you know that you're not hallucinating right now? All I'm doing is I'm playing devil's advocate and arguing that experience is less reliable than you might think it to be. I'm not saying it's not reliable. Of course, we need experience. We need to see and hear and experience the world and respond to it. That's all fine. I'm just saying that it's not completely correct. It's not an authority you should base the most important decisions in your life upon. That's all I'm saying. It's good. It's good for general day-to-day activities. But experience is not an authority when it comes to the ultimate goal of life. What is the ultimate goal of life cannot be determined by experience. It is not authoritative. So we need another authority. So that's, what is the other authority? Well, somebody who lived thousands of years ago with a funny name like Yajnavalkya or Bhrigu, ancient rishis, they discovered the true source of contentment and peace. They discovered what it is to be enlightened, and they set it down in verses that are collected in the Upanishads of the Vedas, which we have an opportunity to study now. Today what we're studying is all based on those ancient teachings we call the Shruti, scripture. So, which is a better authority to base your pursuit, the ultimate pursuit of life? Will you base it on experience, or will you base it on a better authority? A striking example is someone goes to the bar, has some drinks, and say, hey, all my problems went away. I'm not suffering. Of course, the suffering comes back, which means basing, so if and by the way, this is a terrible problem. Alcoholism is a terrible problem when someone decides that alcohol is the solution to my problem of suffering. Many doctors and mental health providers will say that addiction is self-medication to remove suffering. They look upon it as that, and they call addiction itself is said to be an illness. So, look at that. That's a huge mistake if you take your experience to be the ultimate authority. So here, we turn to a greater authority, Yajnavalkya, Bhrigu, and all these great rishis. We turn to the scripture, and the scripture tells us what? Sad asmi iti. This is pramana uta. This is the wisdom based on a proper authority. the authority we find in Scripture. So, conclusions based on the authority of the Scripture are more conclusions about enlightenment and conclusions about the ultimate solution to the, there we go, the Scripture. This is, actually I'm anticipating the next verse, but since I'm right on the cusp of this idea, let me make it clear. Is Scripture an authority on the number of elements? So most scriptures say 5. Did you know that Chandogya only has 3 elements? And then you get an argument, wait a minute, this Upanishad says 3, that Upanishad says 5, which one of them is correct? Well, Scripture is not an authority on the number of elements. So modern science tells us there are 92 naturally existing elements and a whole bunch of elements that we make in the lab. Who's right? I'll go for science any day. Scripture is not an authority on the number of elements. However, Scripture is an authority on the ultimate solution to the problem of suffering. So therefore, we accept the authority of science when it comes to the world. We accept the authority of Scripture when it comes to solving the problem of suffering. In this way, Scripture is a pramana. That's the word I'm explaining. On the other hand, anya dihi, the other conclusion. Anya, other, dihi, conclusion. The other conclusion, which is the other conclusion? Aham karomi iti. I am a limited person engaged in activity. That conclusion is tan nibha udbhava. Tan, that's what's tricky. Tan nibha udbhava. It is, nibha is that which seems like something. It is a seeming, it is something that is udbhava, born in your mind, and it tan-nibha, it seems like you. We're talking about the ahankara, the I identified with the body, mind, and senses. The I that says, I am Swami Taratmananda, I am a man, I am this, I am that, etc., etc. That's what we call ahankara, and it is tan-nibha, it resembles the true I. Or rather, it's a pretense for the true I. It is an imposter. I like that expression. The ahankara is an imposter pretending to be the true self. It was just for fun. I like that approach. And that's what he says in the next line. Pratyakshadi nibha. It is something that is nibha, an appearance, which is born of pratyakshadi, experience. Perception is more literally correct, but we'll just generalize it. Born of experience. So what is your experience? I am a limited individual. And that, Shankara is pointing out that I, the I that says I am a limited individual, he says it is tan-nibha. It is pretending to be you. It is as though you. The I that says I am a limited individual engaged in action, that is the unenlightened ego, the ego that is an imposter. Tan-nibha. So, what Shankara, is a little technical, but what it's underlining is what we just talked about. Your experience is unreliable. And your experience that this is me is unreliable. A good example of how unreliable this experience is, have you ever come back from a dentist appointment and wondered, what is that hanging on my face? Because when it's anesthetized, it doesn't feel like I, does it? It's something hanging on your face. What is that hanging? So look at that. You know, if this is really me, it should be really me all the time. It's an experience which is misleading. This feels like me because of the nervous system. When the nervous system stops working, it no longer feels like me. Just more evidence of how experience fools us, and therefore experience is useful in day-to-day life. Experience is not authoritative when it comes to this ultimate problem of life, the problem of how to come out of suffering. So Shankara then concludes in the last line that this wrong conclusion based on experience, this wrong conclusion, badhyate, gets negated. The wrong conclusion that I am a limited individual engaged in action, trying to eke out some happiness in life, this wrong conclusion, badhyate, is negated through Shruti, Yukti, and Anubhava. And he gives a wonderful example, Digbhrhamadivat. Digbhrama means you're lost. There's literally Brahma, confusion about dik, direction. You're lost. So you've all had the experience of being lost, maybe driving someplace or walking someplace. You're lost, you have no map, you know, your phone, I don't know, GPS is, you left your phone behind, or there's no cell phone connection, whatever. So you're lost. What to do? You're lost until you see a landmark. As soon as you see the landmark, now I get it. Interesting. Now I get it. Sad Brahma Asmiyati. The rishis give you that insight. That insight is like a landmark. You see it and you get that recognition. Oh, now I get it. My experience has been fooling me all this time. I am not this body. I am not this mind. I am the unchanging consciousness. First of all, I am a conscious being. No one can negate that. But I am the unchanging, limitless, vast consciousness, utterly unaffected by anything and everything in the world, the consciousness by which all objects are known, the consciousness by which even body and mind are known. Oh, I get it. So getting these teachings from the scripture is like seeing the landmark. When you see a landmark, you get properly oriented. When you get this teaching from scripture, you get properly oriented. Okay, we'll see one more verse today. Karta bhokteti yachastram, karta bhokteti yachastram, loka buddhyanuvariyata, loka buddhyanuvariyata, sadasmiti shuter jata, sadasmiti shuter jata, Bhadyaten yairtha yaivadihi, Bhadyaten yaitha yaivadihi. Let me introduce this verse. which is a response to a purva paksha. Purva paksha, in American English, not American, in English, devil's point of view. You create an opposing point of view. Devil's advocate. So the devil's advocate will say, wait a minute. The scripture says you are Brahman and that you are not an individual person engaged in action, but the same scripture says, do this ritual. Do that ritual. Do them every year at this time. Do them properly. Here's step 1, here's step 2, here's step 3. All of these details are given by the same scripture. So sometimes the scripture says, you are Brahman, you are not an agent of action. And sometimes scripture says, hey, you are an agent of action, do these rituals. That's a valid argument. Scriptures say both. Of course, you know from other classes that the scriptures are not monolithic. They have sections. There is a karma kanda and a jnana kanda. You've heard this before. So there is a portion of the scripture dedicated to rituals. There is a portion of the scripture dedicated to spiritual wisdom, knowledge. So, keeping that division in view, Shankara says, karta bhokta iti yat shastram. So yat shastram, that scripture, the scripture that refers to karta, refers to you as an agent of action, the one who does rituals, and the scripture that refers to you as the bhokta, the enjoyer, the experiencer, the one who reaps the blessings of doing those rituals. So those particular scriptures, Shankara says, they are loka buddhi anuvadi tat. That scripture is loka buddhi anuvadi. Anuvada is restatement. Loka buddhi, conventional wisdom. Loka buddhi anuvadi, a restatement of conventional wisdom. So, how clear is Shankara's language? Very precise his use of words. So what Shankara says here is that when the karma kanda of the Veda, the ritualistic portion of the scriptures, when they tell you to do all these rituals so that you can reap the religious merit accumulated through those rituals, when the scriptures tell you all that, Shankara points out, that is loka buddhi anuvadi. The scriptures are merely adopting a conventional point of view, treating you as an individual person. That is anuvada. So it's like when the scriptures talk about 5 elements. It's also anuvada. The scriptures are talking about the world. Look at... I'm pausing because there's a big technical discussion here about anuvada and what is the scope of authority. And can I suggest we set some of those technical details aside and just focus on the big picture here, which is, yes, the scripture does address you as an individual being, and that's just the conventional worldview. But later in the Veda, by the way, it's significant that in the Veda, the karma kanda comes first, the jnana kanda comes later. You're thinking, well, so what? Supposedly they came in the opposite order. That is, the Upanishads came first in the Vedas, and all the rituals came later. So you start studying the Vedas, and the Vedas, the opening portions of the Vedas says, you are not an agent of action, therefore don't bother with any rituals. Then you get to the Karma Kanda. You get my point. So the order of Jnana Kanda and Karma Kanda are significant. In fact, it's in this in the Yajurveda, in the Mahanarayana Upanishad. So think about studying the Yajur. By the way, of all the Vedas, Yajurveda has a maximum number of rituals in it. Very complicated rituals described in. So you're studying the Yajurveda and going through ritual after ritual after ritual, and finally you get to this Upanishad, which begins with na karmana na prajaya dhane, na karmana, not through karma. And in that statement, karma means Vedic rituals. So if you're studying Yajurveda, ritual, na karmana, na give up all those rituals. That's literally what happens. And it's because the Vedic scriptures are not monolithic. We have different sections which are intended for different purposes, for different people, for different aspirants. If you want to go to heaven, you better study those rituals. You better perform those rituals. Because the Upanishads won't help you. So if your goal is heaven, those rituals are crucial. So, on the other hand, na karmana, the Upanishad says that those rituals will not solve the ultimate problem and free you from suffering for all eternity. So, Shankara then goes on to say, in the second half, sad asmi iti shutehe, shutehe from the scripture that says sad asmi, I am Brahman. From scriptures that say I am Brahman, jata, what arises, drop down a line, dihi, what arises is a conclusion that badhyate negates anya etaya eva. We have to break all this apart properly. So the Upanishads, the latter part of the scripture, from the latter part of the scripture arises a different conclusion. Not a conclusion that you are a limited individual that has to do a lot of rituals, but an anyadihi, a different conclusion that badhyate negates the prior conclusion. So you start off studying the Vedas. The Vedas assume you are an individual person engaged in actions, including engaged in the performance of rituals. Then you come to the Upanishads. Upanishads that negate the utility of rituals and more. They negate your status as an agent of action and as the one who reaps results. And just let me amplify that a little bit, and then we'll wrap up the class. Does consciousness perform actions? We've been through this many times. Actions. The impetus for any action arises in your mind. And it is known to you as Sakshi, as the awareful witness. The impetus to act is revealed by consciousness. Consciousness reveals the activities of the body and mind, consciousness itself does nothing. It's not an agent of action. Now, according to the doctrine of karma, whoever does an action reaps the result. If consciousness doesn't do an action, does it reap any result? By the way, that's why an enlightened person doesn't get reborn. Because when you realize, I am pure, unchanging consciousness, which is not an agent of action, when that is you, I, me, that means you, as a non-agent, you never did anything. Therefore, you don't reap any results. All the karmas committed in prior lives do not belong to consciousness. The law of karma applies not to consciousness, but applies to the limited being. As long as you are identified with your body and mind, as long as you are engaged in doing activities, absolutely you are subject to the laws of karma. But when you get it, when you see the landmark and you recognize, hey, I am not an agent of action. I am Brahman. With that recognition, the laws of karma no longer affect the true you, consciousness. You become freed from all that karma, and this is the basis for the karmic theory that there's no rebirth for the enlightened person. Okay. Enough said. That's a good place to end our class. A new topic will start in the next verse. Om sarve bhavantu sukhinaha sarve santu niramayaha sarve bhadrani pashyantu ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhavet asato ma satgamaya tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityor ma amritangamaya. Om shanti shanti shanti. Om. That's it.